You're lying in dim light. Maybe it's your bedroom, maybe a quiet room somewhere far from here. Someone across the room glances at you. Just a quick look. They don't say anything. They don't point. They don't move their head much at all. But you know, instantly, without thinking, you know exactly where they're looking. Not just that they're looking in your general direction, but precisely where their gaze lands. On your face, your hands, the book beside you, the window behind your shoulder. That split-second read, that effortless detection of where someone else is looking, it's so automatic you've probably never stopped to think about it. But here's the thing. You shouldn't be able to do that. Not that easily, not that accurately, not in low light from across a room. And yet you can. We all can. The reason is right there in front of you. Literally. It's in your eyes. Or more specifically, it's in the whites of your eyes. That pale ring surrounding your coloured iris. Scientists call it the sclera. And in humans, it's unusually bright, unusually exposed, and creates an unusually stark contrast with the darker iris sitting in the middle. When someone's eyes move, that dark circle shifts position against the white background like a spotlight sweeping across a pale stage. The signal is impossible to miss. Now, if you're listening to this in Berlin at breakfast or Boston at bedtime or somewhere I haven't even imagined, I'd love to know. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Because this story about eyes, about how we read each other across distances and in silence, it connects all of us no matter where we're drifting off tonight. Here's the mystery though. Walk through any zoo, look at any primate, our closest relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, and their eyes look different. Not dramatically. The structure is basically the same. They have sclera too. They have irises. But something about the overall appearance is darker, more shadowed, less stark. For decades, scientists assumed this was simple. Humans have white sclera. Other primates have dark sclera. We're unique. End of story. Except that story turned out to be wrong, or at least dramatically oversimplified. Recent photographic surveys of wild chimpanzees and dozens of other mammal species revealed something surprising. Many of them have white sclera too. Not all individuals, not as uniformly, not as brightly, but it's there, patches of pale sclera visible around darker irises. The difference isn't black and white, it's a spectrum, and humans just happen to sit at one extreme end of that spectrum, unusually pale, unusually exposed, unusually high contrast. So the question shifted. It's not why are humans the only primates with white eyes. It's why are human eyes so consistently, so uniformly, so conspicuously at this extreme? Why do all 8 billion of us have this striking pattern when our closest relatives show so much variation? In 1997, researchers first described the unique morphology of the human eye in the journal Nature. They measured eye dimensions across primate species and found that humans have an unusually large horizontal opening. Our eyes are wider, more exposed. The iris itself is relatively small compared to the visible sclera surrounding it. When you add in the bright depigmentation of that sclera and the contrast against our relatively dark skin around the eyes, the result is unmistakable. A visible signal that broadcasts gaze direction like a biological billboard. But why would evolution do this? Why would natural selection favour eyes that make it so easy for others to see where you're looking? In most primates, direct eye contact is a threat, a challenge. Staring at a chimpanzee is a good way to get attacked. So for them, hiding gaze direction might be advantageous. Don't let others know what you're interested in. Don't reveal your intentions. Keep your eyes cryptic. Humans went the opposite direction. We made our gaze as obvious as possible. Fast forward to 2022, a team of researchers ran an experiment. They showed both humans and chimpanzees images of eyes with different patterns, some with bright white sclera and dark irises like most humans, some with darker sclera, more like typical chimpanzees, some with enlarged irises that left almost no visible sclera at all. Then they asked a simple question. Which pattern makes it easier to tell where someone is looking? The answer was clear. Both humans and chimpanzees were better at reading gaze direction when the eyes had bright white sclera and a darker iris. The human pattern, especially under harder viewing conditions, smaller images, shadowed faces, dim lighting. The bright sclera made gaze direction visible when it would otherwise be ambiguous. So our eye morphology isn't just decorative, it's functional. It genuinely enhances the visibility of where we're looking. That's not speculation, that's measurable. And here's where things get really interesting. Another study in 2022 looked at 108 primate species and measured their scleral brightness. Then they correlated those measurements with behavioral data, social tolerance, cooperation, aggression. What they found was striking. Across the primate family tree, brighter sclera statistically correlated with more cooperative, pro-social behaviors. Darker sclera correlated with higher rates of lethal aggression and competitive social structures. It's as if evolution has been writing our social lives into our eyes. Species that cooperate more have evolved more visible, more readable gaze. Species locked in constant competition have kept their intentions hidden behind darker sclera. But causation is tricky. Did bright sclera enable cooperation? Or did cooperative species evolve bright sclera as a byproduct of something else? And where do humans fit in this picture? That's the puzzle we're going to unravel, because the story of why your eyes look the way they do isn't just about anatomy. It's about cooperation and conflict, trust and deception, the evolution of human sociality, written in a thin layer of depigmented tissue that most people never think about at all. Before we dive into the competing theories and detective work, let's get our bearings. Let's actually look at what we're talking about when we say the human eye is different, because the anatomy matters. The specific measurements matter. Tiny geometric tweaks can have outsized consequences for how we live and communicate. Picture the front of any primate eye. You're looking at three main coloured regions arranged like a target. In the centre, there's the pupil, that dark circle that's actually an opening into the interior of the eye. It expands and contracts depending on light levels, but from the outside it just looks like a black dot. Surrounding the pupil is the iris, the coloured ring, brown or blue or green or hazel, depending on genetics. The iris is a muscle that controls how wide the pupil opens, but what we see is its pigmentation, the part that gives eyes their colour. Then there's the third layer, the one most people don't think about, the sclera, the tough outer coat of the eyeball. In humans, it's that white ring surrounding the iris. But here's the thing. In most primates, the sclera isn't white at all. It's pigmented, often darkly, sometimes matching the tone of the surrounding facial skin so closely that it's hard to tell where the eyelid ends and the eye begins. All of this sits inside a bony orbit, the eye socket carved into your skull, and the eyelids frame a specific opening, the palpebral fissure. That's the technical term for the eye opening, the almond-shaped space between your upper and lower lids when your eye is open. That shape, that opening, varies enormously across primate species, and in humans, it's unusual. Back in 2001, researchers Kobayashi and Koshima ran a massive comparative study. They measured eye morphology across roughly half of all living primate species. Dozens of species, hundreds of individuals, standardized photographs analyzed for specific metrics. What they found was that humans stand out in three distinct ways. First, we've exposed sclera with virtually no pigment, uniformly white, not patches of white, not light brownish, pure, depigmented white surrounding a darker iris. This isn't just rare among primates, it's extreme. Most other primates have some degree of scleral pigmentation that makes the white less white, more muted, more similar in tone to the surrounding skin. Second, we have the highest ratio of exposed sclera to iris among all measured primates. They call this the sclera size index. Essentially, when you look at a human face, you're seeing a lot of white relative to the size of the coloured iris. Our eyelids pull back. Our eyeballs sit positioned in a way that reveals more of the scleral surface. Other primates have eyelids that cover more of the eyeball, resulting in less visible sclera even when the eye is fully open. Third, our eye opening itself is unusually elongated horizontally. Most primates have roughly circular eye openings, height and width pretty similar. Humans have wide, horizontally stretched openings. Our palpebral fissure, width to height ratio, is distinctly greater than 1. We have broad, low eye openings rather than round ones, and this isn't just a soft tissue difference. The skull itself reflects this pattern. A 2015 study measured orbital morphology across great apes and found that humans have unusually wide, low orbits. The bony eye socket is built to accommodate this wide, gaze-revealing eye posture. Evolution didn't just change the soft tissue, it remodeled the bones of our face. Now, compare this to a gorilla. Look at photographs if you're imagining this, or recall any time you've stood in front of a gorilla enclosure. The eyes look darker overall. The sclera, what little you can see of it, tends to be brownish or greyish, not stark white. The iris blends more smoothly into the surround. The eye opening is more circular, more covered by prominent brow ridges and heavy eyelids. The result is an eye that looks smaller, more shadowed, less defined. Orangutans show something similar. Their sclera often has a yellowish or tan pigmentation. The long facial hair and prominent skin folds around the eyes further obscure the boundary between eyelid and eyeball. Even when they're looking directly at you, it's harder to pinpoint exactly where their gaze lands compared to reading a human face. Macaques, those common monkeys used in so much research, have even less visible sclera. Their eye openings are small and round. The sclera that is visible tends to be pigmented to match their facial skin. The overall effect is an eye that reveals very little about gaze direction, unless you're close enough to see the pupil positioned directly. Chimpanzees are more complicated. They're our closest living relatives, and their eyes show more variation than older studies suggested. Some individuals, especially younger ones, have relatively light sclera, but on average, chimpanzee sclera are darker than human sclera, and their eye openings are more circular with less exposed white. The contrast between iris and sclera is lower, and critically, the contrast between the sclera and the surrounding dark facial skin is much lower than in humans, where our relatively light facial skin makes the white sclera stand out even more. A 2022 study used modern image analysis to quantify this. They took photographs of human eyes, chimpanzee eyes, bonobo eyes, and other great apes, then measured luminance contrast. How bright is the sclera compared to the iris? How bright is the sclera compared to the surrounding skin? They also simulated viewing conditions, distance, shadows, visual noise, to see which eye patterns remained readable under degraded information. Humans won by a landslide. Our uniformly white sclera combined with strong luminance contrast between sclera, iris, and skin means that even under poor viewing conditions, the eye outline and iris position remain visible. You can read human gaze direction from across a room in dim light. Try that with a chimpanzee and the signal degrades fast. The eye blends into the face. The gaze becomes ambiguous. This is what scientists mean when they talk about scleral show. It's not just about having white tissue. It's about how much of that white tissue is visible, how it contrasts with everything around it, and what geometric frame your skull and eyelids create to display it. And here's the remarkable thing. These differences seem small on paper. We're talking about a few millimeters of exposure a few shades of pigmentation, a slightly more horizontal eye opening, tiny anatomical tweaks. But the functional consequences are enormous. They transform the human face into a gaze broadcasting system unlike anything else in the primate world. They make silent communication possible at distances and in conditions where it shouldn't work. They turn the eyes into social organs as important as the voice. The question is, why? Why did evolution take our eyes in this direction when our closest relatives went another way? And when exactly did it happen? That's where the detective work begins. The story really begins in 1997, in the pages of Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. Two Japanese researchers, Hiromi Kobayashi and Shiro Koshima, published a short communication with a bold claim. The human eye wasn't just different from other primates. It was uniquely adapted for a specific social function. Broadcasting gaze direction. This wasn't the first time anyone had noticed human eyes looked unusual. Anatomists had been describing primate eye morphology for over a century. But Kobayashi and Koshima were the first to frame it as an adaptive puzzle. They asked why. Why would evolution give us these bright, exposed, gaze-revealing eyes when our closest relatives had evolved in exactly the opposite direction? Their initial paper was brief, more of a provocation than a comprehensive study, but it caught attention. The idea was elegant, simple, the kind of hypothesis that feels right the moment you hear it. Of course our white eyes serve a social function. Of course they evolved to help us communicate. Just look at them. They're obviously designed to be seen. 4 years later, in 2001, Kobayashi and Koshima delivered the full case. They published a massive comparative study in the Journal of Human Evolution. This time, they had the data to back up their claim. Nearly half of all living primate species, 88 species in total, photographed and measured using standardized methods. This wasn't anecdotal observation. This was systematic comparative anatomy at a scale rarely attempted. They developed specific metrics to quantify what makes an eye gaze revealing versus gaze concealing. Scleral exposure ratio, the amount of visible white relative to the size of the iris and the eye opening, scleral pigmentation, whether the white was actually white or darkened by melanin deposits, horizontal elongation, the width to height ratio of the eye opening, measuring how stretched versus circular it appeared. Then they ran the numbers across dozens of primate species: gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, gibbons, macaques, baboons, marmosets, lemurs. The entire primate family tree represented in a single dataset. And when they mapped the results, one species stood alone at the extreme end of every metric: humans. We were the only species in their sample with completely depigmented sclera. Not just light, not just patches of white, uniformly bright white across the entire visible surface. Every other primate showed some degree of melanin pigmentation that muted the scleral color, making it blend more with the surrounding facial skin. We had the highest ratio of exposed sclera to iris. Other primates had eyelids that covered more of the eyeball, or orbits positioned so that less of the scleral surface showed. We had pulled back eyelids and forward-facing eyes that revealed maximum white. And we had the most horizontally elongated eye openings. Most primates had roughly circular openings. Ours were stretched wide, creating what Kobayashi and Koshima called an extraordinarily elongated eye outline. They calculated that this shape served a dual function. It widened the horizontal visual field, letting us see more peripherally. But more importantly, it created a wider canvas for displaying the position of the iris against the white background. A built-in direction indicator. Their conclusion was striking. The human eye had been shaped by natural selection to make gaze direction as visible as possible. We weren't just passively different from other primates. We had actively evolved in the opposite direction. While most primates were evolving to hide where they were looking, we were evolving to advertise it. And they had a hypothesis for why. Gaze concealment versus gaze signaling. Two competing evolutionary strategies driven by different social ecologies. Most primates live in competitive hierarchies. Dominant individuals don't want subordinates predicting their next move. Subordinates don't want to reveal their intentions to dominants. Under those conditions, natural selection would favor cryptic eyes, dark sclera that blend with facial skin, minimal scleral exposure, anything that makes it harder for others to track exactly where you're looking. But early humans, they suggested, evolved under different pressures: high cooperation, extensive joint attention, activities that required coordinating visual focus between individuals, hunting together, teaching complex skills, sharing information about distant threats or resources. Under these conditions, being able to rapidly share gaze direction would provide enormous advantages. And the easiest way to broadcast gaze is through bright, exposed, contrasting eye morphology. The paper became hugely influential, not just among specialists but in popular science. Here was a single anatomical feature that seemed to explain something fundamental about human nature. We are the cooperative ape, the communicative ape, and you can see it written in our eyes, literally. Over the next 2 decades, the finding got simplified and amplified. Science journalists loved it. Documentary producers loved it. It became a staple explanation in books about human evolution. The whites of our eyes make us human. They're the windows through which we signal our cooperative intentions. They're the reason we can build complex societies, teach elaborate skills, coordinate in ways no other primate can match. The claim got repeated so often it started to sound like established fact. Only humans have visible whites of the eyes. It appeared in textbooks. It showed up in museum exhibits. It became one of those things everybody just knew about human uniqueness, filed alongside our big brains and our upright posture. Michael Tomasello, the influential developmental psychologist who would later formalize the cooperative eye hypothesis, built directly on Kobayashi and Koshima's anatomical foundation. If humans really were the only primates with exposed white sclera, and if that morphology really did enhance gaze visibility, then it made perfect sense to interpret it as an adaptation for cooperative communication. The anatomy seemed to demand that interpretation. Researchers started testing predictions derived from the white eye hypothesis. They ran experiments showing that humans and even chimpanzees could more easily track gaze direction when the sclera was made artificially bright versus when it was darkened. They documented how human infants follow eye gaze but not head direction alone, suggesting we're built to extract social information from visible eye patterns. They showed that adults unconsciously judge faces with visible white sclera as more trustworthy and cooperative than faces with darker or less visible eyes. Everything seemed to fit. The anatomy predicted the behavior explained the anatomy. Kobayashi and Koshima's morphological data provided the empirical foundation for an entire research program investigating the evolutionary origins of human social cognition. But science doesn't stand still, and data has a way of complicating clean narratives. Over the next 20 years, as more researchers took a closer look at primate eyes, as photographic databases expanded, as image analysis techniques became more sophisticated, cracks started appearing in the old story. The claim that humans were the only primates with visible white sclera. That started looking less certain. The idea that our eyes were categorically different from all other primates. That needed revision. The assumption that dark-eyed species were actively concealing their gaze while light-eyed species were advertising it. That turned out to be more complicated than anyone had imagined. What looked like a solved problem in 2001 was about to become a wide-open question again. By 2007, the anatomical data was clear. Humans had unusually visible eyes, bright white sclera, wide horizontal openings, maximum exposure. But anatomy alone doesn't explain function. You can describe what something looks like without understanding what it's for. That's where Michael Tomasello came in. Tomasello wasn't primarily an anatomist. He was a developmental psychologist and primatologist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. For decades, he'd been studying how human cognition differs from that of our closest relatives. Not just whether we're smarter, but how we think differently, how we cooperate differently, how we build shared understanding in ways that other primates don't. And in 2007, he put all the pieces together. The morphology Kobayashi and Koshima had documented, the developmental studies of infant attention, the broader theories about human ultrasociality. He published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution with a hypothesis so elegant it would dominate discussions of human eye evolution for the next 15 years. He called it the cooperative eye hypothesis. The logic was straightforward. If you're a species that depends heavily on cooperation, you need reliable ways to coordinate behavior. Sometimes you can talk, but often, especially during activities like hunting or foraging, silence is critical. You can't shout instructions when you're stalking prey. You can't debate strategy when a predator is nearby. What you need is a way to silently say, "Look over there. Pay attention to this. I'm watching that." And the most efficient way to do that is through gaze itself. Not pointing, not gesturing, just looking. But for that to work, your gaze has to be visible. The person you're trying to coordinate with needs to be able to see exactly where your eyes are pointing. And that requires contrast. A dark iris against a bright background. Maximum scleral exposure. Horizontal elongation to widen the display. Exactly the morphology humans have. Tomasello argued that our visible white sclera evolved specifically to make gaze direction conspicuous. Not as a side effect of something else. Not as a neutral variation that happened to spread, but as a direct adaptation for cooperative communication. Natural selection favored individuals whose eye morphology made it easier for others to read their visual attention. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this selection pressure shaped our eyes into precision, gaze broadcasting instruments. But Tomasello didn't just theorize, he tested. The key experiment compared great apes with human infants. The setup was simple. A human experimenter sat across from a subject, either an ape or a child, and performed 4 different conditions in random order. Eyes-only movement, looking up with the head held still. Head-only movement, tilting the head upward but keeping the eyes closed. Both head and eyes moving up together. Or control, no movement at all. The question was, which cues would the subjects follow? Would they track where the experimenter's head pointed? Where the eyes pointed? Both. Neither. The results were striking. Great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans all showed the same pattern. They followed head direction. When the experimenter tilted her head up, the apes looked up. When she moved only her eyes, they mostly ignored it. The head was the primary social cue. The eyes were secondary at best. Human infants showed exactly the opposite pattern. Even very young children, 12 to 18 months old, relied almost exclusively on eye direction. When the experimenter looked up with her eyes but kept her head still, the infants followed the gaze. When she tilted her head but kept her eyes closed, they were far less likely to look. For human children, the eyes carried special significance. They were the primary channel for tracking attention. This wasn't just about vision. It was about what counts as socially meaningful information. Apes and humans both can see eyes. Both have decent visual acuity. but humans treat eye direction as a critical social signal in a way that other primates don't, and Tomasello argued that our distinctive eye morphology evolved to support exactly this heightened sensitivity to gaze. He connected this to his broader theory of shared intentionality, the idea that humans, uniquely among primates, engage in genuine joint attention. Not just you looking at something and me looking at the same thing, but us looking together, aware that we're both attending to the same target, creating a kind of mental triangle. Me, you, and the object of our shared focus. This triadic structure, Tomasello argued, is the foundation for everything distinctively human. Language depends on it. You can't learn word meanings unless you and a teacher can jointly attend to the same referent. Teaching depends on it. You can't transmit skills unless both parties focus on the same actions and objects. Cooperation depends on it. You can't coordinate complex tasks unless you can silently align your attention with others, and visible eye whites make that alignment vastly easier. In a species where joint attention is critical, any improvement in the visibility of gaze direction provides massive benefits. You hunt more effectively when you can silently coordinate who's watching which escape route. You forage more safely when you can share warnings about distant predators without vocalizing. You teach more efficiently when a simple glance can direct a child's attention to the relevant feature of a tool or technique. Picture it. Early humans on an African savanna moving through tall grass in the late afternoon. They're tracking a herd of antelope, trying to position themselves for an ambush. But they're also being watched. A lioness has been following them, staying downwind, waiting for someone to make a mistake. One hunter notices movement in the grass 30 meters to the left. Not the antelope, something else, something low and tawny. He can't point, can't shout. Any sudden movement or sound will scatter the herd and alert the predator, so he does the only thing he can. He looks. A quick, deliberate shift of his gaze toward the threat, and because his eyes are human eyes, with bright white sclera and dark irises creating maximum contrast, the woman beside him catches the movement instantly. She sees exactly where he's looking, follows his gaze, spots the lioness, freezes, signals the others with her own gaze. Within seconds, the entire group has silently communicated and updated their mental model of the situation. They abandon the hunt, slowly back away. The lioness, realizing she's been spotted, slinks off to find easier prey. Nobody said a word, but everyone survived, and they survived because they could read each other's eyes. That's the elegance of Tomasello's hypothesis. It ties anatomy directly to behavior, and behavior directly to the ecological pressures that made humans what we are. We're not just the ape with big brains or upright posture. We're the cooperative ape, the ape that builds shared intentions and cumulative culture. And you can see that in our eyes. They evolved to be read, to broadcast where we're looking, to turn gaze itself into a communicative channel. The hypothesis became hugely influential, especially in developmental psychology and evolutionary anthropology. It offered a simple, testable explanation for a distinctive human trait. It linked morphology with cognition and social ecology, and it made intuitive sense. Of course our eyes evolved for cooperation. Just look at what we do with them. But there was a problem lurking in the background, a problem that wouldn't become fully apparent until more than a decade later, when researchers finally looked carefully at the eyes of other primates with better tools and larger samples. Tomasello's hypothesis, elegant as it was, rested on a key assumption that dark sclera in other primates represented the baseline, the default state from which human bright sclera had diverged, that our eyes were categorically different, uniquely white, uniquely exposed, uniquely adapted for signaling, and that assumption, as it turned out, needed serious revision. But what if we've been telling the story backward? Tomasello's cooperative eye hypothesis asks why humans evolved bright white sclera. It treats dark eyes as the default, the starting point, and then explains how selection for cooperation pushed us toward visibility. But there's another way to frame the puzzle. What if dark sclera aren't a neutral baseline at all? What if they're an adaptation in their own right? An active evolutionary solution to a very different social problem. Enter the gaze camouflage hypothesis. The idea is simple, but radical. In species where social life is competitive, hierarchical, and often violent, broadcasting your gaze direction could be dangerous. It reveals what you're interested in, what you're planning, who you're watching, and in a world where dominance matters, where resources are contested, where direct eye contact can trigger aggression, hiding your gaze might be the smarter strategy. Think about it from the perspective of a rhesus macaque living in a troop of 50 individuals. The social hierarchy is rigid. Alpha males control access to food and mates. Subordinates who challenge that control get attacked, sometimes seriously injured. And one of the primary ways dominance is asserted and tested is through eye contact. A direct stare is a threat. It says, "I'm not backing down. I'm ready to fight." If you're a low-ranking male in that world, the last thing you want is to accidentally broadcast that you're looking at food the alpha wants, or that you're watching a female he's guarding, or that you're assessing his strength, calculating whether you could take him in a fight. Any of those signals sent unintentionally through visible gaze direction could provoke immediate aggression. Better to keep your eyes cryptic. Better to let your dark sclera blend with your iris so nobody can tell exactly where you're looking. That's gaze camouflage. The evolutionary logic is that in competitive, high-threat social environments, selection favors darker sclera because they conceal gaze direction. They make your eyes harder to read. They reduce the risk that others will intercept the subtle signals of your visual attention and use them against you. This wasn't just theoretical speculation. In 2020, a crowdsourced study across multiple zoos documented something primatologists had long known anecdotally. Eye contact tolerance varies dramatically across primate species. In hierarchical monkeys like baboons and macaques, direct gaze is almost universally met with aggression or submission displays. Stare at a baboon and it will either attack or flee, depending on its rank and temperament. But in more egalitarian species, especially bonobos, eye contact is far less threatening. They tolerate face-to-face gaze, sometimes even seem to seek it out during social interactions. The pattern suggested a deep connection between social structure and the meaning of gaze. In species where competition dominates, where violence is common, where hierarchy is enforced through intimidation, eye contact becomes weaponized. It's not neutral information sharing, it's a challenge, a claim, a threat. And if that's the social context, then hiding your gaze makes perfect evolutionary sense. But the gaze camouflage hypothesis needed more than behavioral observations. It needed anatomical predictions. If dark sclera evolved to hide gaze in competitive species, then across primates, there should be a statistical relationship between scleral coloration and social behavior. Darker eyes should correlate with more violence, more competition, more social tension. Lighter eyes should correlate with more cooperation, more tolerance, more peaceful interaction. That's exactly what researchers tested in 2022. A team led by comparative psychologists measured scleral brightness across dozens of primate species using standardized photographs and image analysis software. Then they compiled data on social behavior from existing literature. Proactive prosociality, how often individuals help others without being asked. Social tolerance, how close individuals can sit without tension. And most strikingly, rates of conspecific lethal aggression. The percentage of deaths in a population caused by members of the same species killing each other. The results were remarkable. Across 15 species where detailed cooperation data existed, brighter sclera were significantly associated with higher prosociality and greater tolerance. Across 108 species where violence data was available, darker sclera were significantly correlated with higher rates of lethal aggression. The statistics held even when controlling for body size, brain size, and evolutionary relatedness. The pattern was exactly what gaze camouflage predicts. Species that live in more violently competitive social worlds have darker eyes. Species that live in more cooperative, tolerant social worlds have lighter eyes. And the researchers noted something else. Synthesizing dark pigment is metabolically expensive. It requires resources. Energy. It's not free. Which means maintaining dark sclera isn't just a leftover default trait from some ancient ancestor. It's something natural selection actively maintains because it provides advantages. And in competitive environments, one of those advantages is making your gaze harder to read. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These findings don't contradict the cooperative eye hypothesis. They complement it, reframe it, expand it into something bigger. Maybe the question isn't why did humans evolve white sclera? Maybe it's why did so many other primates evolve and maintain dark sclera? Maybe our ancestors once had darker eyes, back when early hominins lived in more competitive, more violent social structures. And then, as our lineage became more cooperative, as we developed the kinds of social arrangements that favored joint attention and shared intentions, selection relaxed the pressure for gaze camouflage. We didn't need to hide our eyes anymore, so we stopped investing the metabolic resources required to keep them dark. The pigment faded, the whites became visible, not because we evolved something new for cooperation, but because we lost something old that had been maintained for competition. It's the same kind of story we see in domestication. Wild animals often have cryptic coloration, dark markings that help them hide from predators or avoid aggression from conspecifics. But domestic animals, living in safer, more controlled environments, often lose that coloration. Dogs have white patches, pigs have pink skin, domesticated foxes develop floppy ears and lighter coats, not because breeders selected for those traits directly, but because relaxed selection against conspicuousness allowed variations to emerge. If humans underwent something like self-domestication, selecting against aggression, favoring tameness and cooperation, then losing our gaze camouflage would be a natural side effect. The white sclera wouldn't be an adaptation for cooperation. They'd be a signature of reduced competition, evidence that our social world had changed so fundamentally that hiding our gaze was no longer necessary. But you don't have to choose between the two hypotheses. Natural selection rarely works through single pressures. More often, multiple forces act simultaneously, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes pulling in different directions. It's entirely possible that early in human evolution, relaxed competition allowed lighter sclera to emerge, and then, once they were present, cooperation-based selection amplified them, made them even brighter, even more visible, even more useful for joint attention and coordinated action. The result would be the same conspicuously white human eyes, but the evolutionary path would be richer, more nuanced, not simple story of adaptation for a single function, but a complex interplay of changing social pressures, relaxed constraints, and new opportunities. And that brings us to the real puzzle. If dark sclera are adaptive camouflage in competitive species, and if human evolution involved a shift away from that kind of competition, then other species that made similar social transitions should show similar eye changes. Are there other primates with lighter sclera? Other cooperative species where gaze camouflage relaxed? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. But not in the places or ways anyone expected, and that discovery would upend the entire conversation about uniquely human eyes. For a long time, the answer seemed obvious. Open any textbook from the early 2000s, and you'll see the same confident claim repeated again and again. Humans are the only primates with visible whites of the eyes, the only ones whose sclera are bright, uniform, easy to see across a room, Chimpanzees? Dark, inscrutable gaze. Gorillas? Same. Monkeys? Same. The story wrote itself. We were special. Our bright sclera proved it. Except, we'd mostly been looking at the wrong chimps. In 2023, a team led by researchers at the University of Texas at Austin decided to test the old story properly. Not with a handful of zoo animals photographed under fluorescent lights, but with a real population, in a real forest, living real chimpanzee lives. Picture the Ngogo community in Kibale National Park, Uganda. Hundreds of chimps ranging through misty valleys and sunlit clearings. Infants clinging to their mothers, adolescents wrestling in the leaf litter, old males watching from the shadows. Over years of fieldwork, researchers had quietly accumulated a treasure trove. More than 1,000 close-up photographs of 230 individually known wild chimpanzees. Different ages, different family lines, different times of day. Eyes caught in full sun, in dappled shade, in the low light of evening. Then someone asked a simple question. What if we actually measure their sclera? When they did, the results were not what anyone had been expecting. About 15% of those wild chimps had clearly white sclera in at least one eye. Another 40% had lighter sclera, tan or brown, or patchy depigmentation. Only a minority had the uniformly dark, all-brown eyes that had become the standard image of chimpanzee gaze. In other words, a wild chimp community, our classic stand-in for dark-eyed cryptic primate, turned out to be full of individuals whose eyes in the right light showed visible whites. The problem wasn't that earlier scientists had been careless. It was that their data were thin. A few captive chimps in zoos, a few opportunistic photos taken at odd angles, often indoors, often with reflections or shadows hiding the edges of the eye. Under those conditions, even a human eye can look darker, flatter, less expressive. Add to that a subtle bias. We tend to remember the images that confirm our stories. When your hypothesis says chimps have dark, secretive eyes, the photos that stick in your head are the ones that fit. The others, the ones where a glint of white shows in the corner, feel like exceptions. Noise, easy to forget. The Ngogo dataset made forgetting impossible. Hundreds of individuals, each photographed multiple times, each eye visible from multiple angles. When you line those images up on a screen, you can't pretend the variation isn't there. Some chimps have eyes not so different from a sleepy human's. A soft ring of pale sclera around a dark iris. Easy to see, easy to track. And Ngogo wasn't the only surprise. In the same project, the team looked beyond primates. They surveyed 70 mammal species in zoos, going enclosure by enclosure, camera in hand, documenting eyes, dogs, horses, antelopes, big cats, rodents. 19 species had at least one individual with visible white sclera, a herding dog trotting along the fence line with a flash of white as it glanced sideways, a horse watching a handler approach, the outer corner of the eye a stark white crescent, a bovid turning its head, sclera bright against a dark face. Suddenly, the neat boundary around human uniqueness started to blur. Eye whites weren't an on-off switch, a magical trait that appears in humans and vanishes in everything else. They were scattered across the mammal tree like small lanterns, some bright, some dim, some flickering only in particular breeds or individuals. That forced a deeper question. If other species have visible sclera too, what exactly is special about us? To answer that, we have to zoom back in on the great apes, humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, 3 close cousins, 3 versions of the same basic eye design. For years the comparison went like this. Humans have white sclera and a darker iris. Chimpanzees have dark sclera that blend into the iris. Bonobos are somewhere in between. But when researchers began to measure brightness and contrast carefully, pixel by pixel, a more subtle pattern emerged. Humans and bonobos actually share a similar arrangement. In both species, the sclera is lighter than the iris. If you turn the photos into black and white and measure luminance, the actual lightness values, the eye whites are consistently brighter than the coloured centre. That makes the direction of gaze easy to read. When the dark iris slides over that light background, the movement is obvious. Chimpanzees, by contrast, tend to invert the pattern. Their sclera are darker, their iris is relatively lighter. At a glance, that can make the whole eye look uniformly dark. But if you measure the contrast between sclera and iris in terms of brightness difference, something interesting appears. In some analyses, the overall contrast in chimp eyes falls into the same range as in humans and bonobos. The difference isn't that chimps have no contrast, it's that the contrast is reversed and sometimes smaller, which means a chimpanzee's gaze may be more conspicuous than our old mental picture allowed. Not an invisible cryptic eye, but a different style of visibility. Dark border, paler centre, rather than pale border, darker centre. Now add in another human twist. Our sclera aren't just light. They're uniformly depigmented and highly exposed. The white extends broadly around the iris. The eyelids leave a large area uncovered. In many other primates and mammals, what sclera you can see is tucked into corners, partially hidden by lids, or broken by patches of pigmentation. So the picture shifts. The right statement isn't only humans have whites of the eyes. It's closer to this. Across mammals, sclera colour is a spectrum. Some are almost fully pigmented and dark. Some are mottled, tan or brown. Some are clearly white. Many species, including chimpanzees, dogs, horses and several bovids, have individuals where the sclera shows up visibly in everyday life. What sets humans apart is that we sit at one extreme of that spectrum. Our sclera are not just light, they're maximally light, maximally uniform and maximally exposed. We turn the volume all the way up. That has important consequences for the cooperative eye hypothesis. The simplest, older version of the idea went like this. No other primate has visible sclera. We evolved white sclera to stand out from a world of dark hidden eyes. Therefore, our bright eye whites must be a uniquely human adaptation for cooperation. The new data won't let that story stand in its original form, because if chimpanzees can have visible sclera, then visible sclera on its own can't be the magic key. If dogs' eye whites flash when they glance sideways, but dogs are not human-level cooperators, then sclera alone can't guarantee complex joint attention. If bonobos share the light sclera, darker iris pattern, then that pattern might have evolved earlier in the ape lineage, before our species even existed. But the new data also don't kill the cooperative eye idea. They refine it. Maybe the trait that matters isn't white versus not white, as if evolution flicked a switch one day. Maybe what matters is degree. How bright, how uniform, how exposed, how easy it is in a dense, noisy social world to tell where someone else is looking from across a campfire, a savanna, a riverbank. On that scale, humans really are unusual. Our eyes seem designed to make gaze direction as obvious as possible. High contrast between iris and sclera. Large visible area. Minimal pigment to muddy the signal. In lab experiments, those features do exactly what theory predicts. They make it easier for both humans and chimpanzees to detect where a pair of eyes is pointing. Children as young as 5 spontaneously see faces with bright sclera as more cooperative partners than faces with darkened sclera. So the cooperative eye hypothesis survives, but in a more modest form. It no longer rests on the claim that only humans have eye whites. Instead, it says something like this. Across mammals and primates, scleral colour and contrast vary. That variation is not random. It tracks, at least loosely, with social style. more cooperation and tolerance in species with brighter eyes, more violence and competition in species with darker eyes. Over time, in our lineage, selection for cooperation, combined with relaxed pressure for gaze camouflage, pushed us farther and farther toward the bright end of that spectrum until our sclera became the extreme case we see today. Not a miracle trait that appears from nowhere, but the far edge of a long gradient. And that raises a new set of questions. If our eyes are one extreme of a broader pattern, what else changed with them? Did the same pressures that brightened our sclera reshape our faces, our temperaments, our social norms? Did we, without realizing it, drift into a kind of self-domestication, softening our edges while our eyes grew clearer and clearer? To answer that, we have to step back from the eyeball itself and look at the whole animal, the skull, the hormones, the behavior, the strange looping process by which a species can, in effect, tame itself. That's where the story of our bright eyes goes next. The idea starts with a strange comparison. Imagine a wolf and a sled dog standing side by side in the snow. Same species technically, almost the same genes, but everything about them feels different. The wolf's face is long, severe, ears sharp, body lean and tense, built for flight or fight. The dog's face is shorter, softer, ears may be floppy, body more rounded, less skittish, more willing to look you in the eye. Now line up a wild boar and a domestic pig, a wild horse and a pony, a jungle fowl and a laying hen. Over and over, you see a similar pattern. It's so common that biologists gave it a name: domestication syndrome. Across many mammals, when you breed for reduced fear and reduced reactive aggression, when you pick the tamest, the calmest, generation after generation, the same odd cluster of traits tends to appear, not just in behavior but in bones and skin and fur. Snouts shorten, jaws and teeth get smaller, bodies become slightly lighter, more gracile. Ears get floppier, tails curl or shrink. Coat patterns change. White patches appear on the forehead, the paws, the belly. Spots of depigmentation where pigment cells never quite arrived. It's as if calming an animal's temper sends a faint ripple through its whole body, soothing the mind, softening the face, bleaching bits of the coat. In the early 2000s, a group of researchers tried to explain this ripple. They pointed to something called neural crest cells. In a vertebrate embryo, neural crest cells are like a roaming construction crew. They start near the developing spinal cord, then migrate outward, turning into all sorts of structures. Pigment cells in the skin and hair, parts of the facial skeleton and jaws, pieces of the peripheral nervous system, and crucially, parts of the adrenal glands, which help control fear and stress responses. Tweak how those cells proliferate or migrate, make them a little fewer or a little later to arrive, and you might get a suite of small changes all at once. Slightly weaker stress responses, slightly shorter faces, slightly less pigment in some areas. That's the neural crest hypothesis for domestication syndrome. You don't need a separate gene or selection pressure for floppy ears, and another for white patches and another for shorter snouts. You just need a gentle, consistent pressure for reduced fear and explosive aggression. Select for the friendlier fox, the calmer dog, the pig that doesn't panic at a fence. The rest can follow as side effects of nudging that embryonic construction crew. Now take that idea and point it at us. Look at a modern human skull next to the skull of an archaic Homo from hundreds of thousands of years ago, or next to a chimpanzee. Our faces are shorter, flatter, more tucked under, jaws smaller, teeth reduced, brow ridges smoothed, canines blunted, bodies more gracile, sexual dimorphism less extreme. We look, in a literal skeletal sense, more juvenile, more like the adolescent stage of earlier hominins, stretched out and frozen. Our behavior, too, is strange for an ape. We do commit horrific violence, but most of it is planned, organized, channeled into warfare or punishment. What we are unusually good at is tamping down spur-of-the-moment rage inside small groups, suppressing the impulse to lash out at a neighbour over a slight, living in dense communities with strangers without constant bloodshed. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham calls this contrast the goodness paradox. Compared to other apes, we are startlingly good at day-to-day cooperation, surprisingly bad at sudden hot-blooded violence, and frighteningly capable of cold, deliberate aggression when it's socially sanctioned. Put the bones and the behaviour together, and some researchers began to wonder, what if we domesticated ourselves, not in cages or barns, but in villages and camps and extended kin networks? Over hundreds of thousands of years, what if our ancestors quietly, consistently selected against the most explosively aggressive individuals? The ones who couldn't control their tempers, the bullies, the unpredictable killers. What if those people were more likely to be exiled, executed, or simply never chosen as mates? If so, the logic of domestication syndrome might apply to us too. Reduced reactive aggression, calmer baseline behaviour, faces softening, bodies gracilizing, neotenous traits persisting into adulthood, a slow, collective self-taming. And somewhere in that cascade of changes, another small, pale patch might have begun to spread. The sclera. On this view, you don't have to assume that ancient people sat around saying, "I will only mate with those whose eye whites are especially bright." You don't need bright sclera to be the main target of selection. They can ride along. If neural crest cells help supply pigment cells to the outer coat and to the tissues around the eye, and if selection for reduced aggression subtly alters how those cells move and multiply, then depigmented sclera could appear as a byproduct. A little extra bleaching, not just on the forehead or muzzle like in a dog, but in the thin, exposed tissue that wraps around the iris. In other words, you don't evolve white sclera for cooperation directly. You evolve a tamer ape with slightly altered embryology. The tamer ape comes packaged with softer faces, a tweaked stress system, and incidentally brighter eyes. It's a neat story, but stories are cheap. The question is whether the world looks anything like it. Here, the bonobos step onto the stage. Imagine two forests, separated by the wide, slow sweep of the Congo River. On one side, chimpanzees, on the other, bonobos. They share a common ancestor fairly recently in evolutionary time. Their bodies and brains are broadly similar, but their social lives are not. Chimpanzee communities are politically intense. Male coalitions, border patrols, violent raids, infanticide, high levels of lethal aggression between groups, plenty of cooperation within alliances, but a background hum of danger. Bonobos, by contrast, are famously more relaxed. Conflict is often diffused with play, grooming, or sex. Female coalitions keep male aggression in check. Lethal violence is dramatically lower. They are not saintly. They compete. They fight. But the temperature of everyday interaction is cooler, more tolerant. Some researchers have suggested that bonobos are a kind of naturally self-domesticated ape. Isolated south of the river, with less need for intense competition over patchy resources, they may have experienced selection against reactive aggression similar to our own, but on a different branch of the family tree. Now look at their eyes. When scientists measure scleral brightness and contrast across primates, a pattern emerges. Bonobos and humans both tend to have lighter sclera than their irises. Chimpanzees, in many cases, show the reversed pattern. Darker sclera, relatively lighter irises. Bonobo eye whites are not as uniformly bright and exposed as ours, but they lean in the same direction. Lighter, more conspicuous, easier to read. Put that next to their social styles, and it becomes tempting to draw a line. Brighter sclera, gentler baseline interactions. Darker sclera, more violent, competitive social norms. Across a wider set of primates, Some recent analyses seem to support that broad correlation. Species with cooperatively tolerant societies tend to have brighter eyes. More combative species tend to cluster at the darker end. This is where the self-domestication hypothesis for our eyes finds its charm. It ties a small, quiet detail, the whiteness of the sclera, into a grander pattern of change. Instead of treating bright eye whites as a lonely adaptation floating in isolation, it weaves them into a bundle with softened skulls, altered hormone systems, and new social rules. Our eyes are not just signaling devices. They are part of a larger metamorphosis from a more dangerous ape into an animal that can share food, share space, and watch one another without constant fear. In that light, the cooperative eye hypothesis and the self-domestication idea stop being rivals and start looking like partners. Self-domestication might have turned down the volume on our reactive aggression, and via neural crest tweaks lightened our sclera. Once those brighter eyes were in place, social selection could then fine-tune them, pushing toward even greater contrast and exposure because they made reading gaze, and therefore cooperating, easier and more reliable. A two-step story. First, tame the ape, then sharpen the gaze. But this is still a hypothesis, not a verdict. Some geneticists are skeptical that a single neural crest mechanism can explain the entire domestication syndrome, let alone the subtleties of human eye color. When they dig into the DNA of different domestic animals, they often find a patchwork of changes rather than one unified pathway. Floppy ears might follow one genetic route, coat spots another, jaw shape a third. By the same token, we don't yet have direct fossil or genetic evidence pinpointing when our sclera became as uniformly white as they are today, or whether that shift coincided with clear markers of self-domestication. Bone fossilizes, soft tissue does not. We're inferring a lot from patterns, analogies, and modern variation. There's also the danger of seeing what we want to see. Because the self-domestication story is so elegant, it links temperament, anatomy, and our bright eyes in one sweeping arc. It's easy to forget how much uncertainty still hangs over every step. Did selection against reactive aggression really play out the same way in different human groups? How much of our scleral brightness is drift and sexual selection, a byproduct of finding symmetrical, clear eyes attractive? How much is direct adaptation for signaling, and how much is embryological collateral? For now, we can't say. What we can say is this. When you look in the mirror at your own eyes, you're not just seeing a tool for tracking gaze. You might also be seeing the faint watermark of a much deeper transformation. A species that, over countless generations, learned to live with itself by softening, just enough, the hair-trigger violence in its own heart. And as that temper cooled, the gaze grew clearer. In the next part of the story, we'll step away from aggression and tameness and look at a different possibility altogether. Maybe our eye whites didn't just ride along on domestication. Maybe, once they were there, they became part of what we found beautiful in one another, a quiet signal of youth, health, and trustworthiness. A canvas not just for cooperation, but for desire. Imagine two people sitting across a fire from each other, long before cities, long before writing. Maybe they're trading stories after a hunt. Maybe they're negotiating a marriage, or just stealing glances when they think no one is watching. The flames flicker, shadows move over their faces, and every so often one of them looks up, and the light catches the eyes of the other. Not the shape of the eye, not the colour of the iris, the whites, clear, bright, framed by dark lashes and smoke-stained skin. A small flash of contrast that says, without words, I am awake, I am young, I am not sick. Up to this point, we've talked about eyes mostly as tools for cooperation and as side effects of self-domestication. The gaze as a social instrument, the sclera as collateral damage from taming an ape. But there's another layer to this story, softer, more subjective, less about survival in a direct sense, and more about the strange, powerful ways we decide who we're drawn to. Because your eye whites are also part of what makes a face beautiful. When psychologists show people pictures of faces and quietly tweak just the colour of the sclera, no change in cheekbones, no change in jawline, nothing else. Something consistent happens. Make the sclera a little redder, a little yellower, and the same face suddenly looks older, more tired, less healthy, less attractive. Make the sclera a little clearer and whiter within a natural range, not cartoonishly bright, and the judgments flip. The face looks younger, fresher, healthier, more appealing. You don't have to think about it. You probably don't even notice you're doing it. But in a fraction of a second, your brain reads that tiny patch of exposed tissue as a quick health report. Part of this is simple biology. As we age, the sclera tends to pick up pigment and lipids. Years of sunlight and tiny injuries leave faint traces. The membrane slowly shifts on average from bright white toward cream, sometimes towards a hint of yellow. Illnesses can do the same thing in more dramatic fashion. Jaundice, infections, chronic inflammation. Your ancestors didn't know about UV exposure or bilirubin levels, but they could see the end result. Eyes clouded by age or sickness, eyes rimmed in red from infection or dulled by exhaustion, eyes bright and clear in the young and healthy. Over tens of thousands of years, in small communities where everyone knew everyone else, those tiny cues could matter. If you have any choice at all in who you partner with, and humans, unlike many animals often do, you'll lean, even unconsciously, towards signs of vitality, toward faces that look less worn down, less inflamed, less ill. And the sclera, sitting right there at the centre of the face, is one of the cleanest signals. In modern studies, people reliably rate faces with whiter sclera as more attractive, more trustworthy, and more energetic than the exact same faces with slightly reddened or yellowed sclera. There's a sweet spot. Natural-looking brightness seems to be enough. Making the whites unnaturally super white doesn't keep boosting attractiveness forever. But within the range that real humans show, clearer generally beats duller. Now imagine that long before laboratories and rating scales, our ancestors already had these preferences, not as explicit rules, but as gut feelings. Over and over, generation after generation, people choosing mates whose eyes looked a little clearer, a little more alive. If some earlier change, self-domestication, or a random mutation, or the demands of cooperation, had already started to lighten the sclera slightly, those preferences could grab hold of that variation and pull. This is where sexual selection steps into the story. In natural selection, traits spread because they help you survive long enough to reproduce. In sexual selection, traits spread because they help you find a partner willing to reproduce with you. A tail that's a bit too long, a song that's a bit too elaborate, a patch of colour that stands out a bit too much. These might not help you escape predators or find food. In fact, they can be costly. But if they make you irresistible to the other sex, they can still win. With eyes, the costs and benefits are subtler. Bright sclera don't seem to be the peacock's tail of the human face. They're quieter than that. But they might have nudged mate choice all the same. Once some degree of scleral depigmentation was in place for any reason, individuals with slightly clearer, more symmetric, more uniformly bright eye whites could have been seen, at a deep intuitive level, as better bets, healthier, younger, more likely to produce surviving offspring. Each small preference is a weak force, but weak forces, working patiently over 100,000 years, can move mountains. Or at least they can bleach the soft outer layer of a primate's eye. and as those preferences compounded, something like a runaway process could have started. Brighter sclera became more common. As they became more common, they became part of what a normal or beautiful human face looked like. That, in turn, might have sharpened the preference further. You can picture it as a feedback loop, a spark, some initial lightning from drift or self-domestication or cooperative signaling, followed by slow, spiraling amplification through mate choice. Not a conscious fashion trend, but an evolutionary one. However, evolution does not always move in straight lines driven by taste. Sometimes it staggers, takes detours, and stumbles into outcomes no one, not even natural selection, really meant. This is where genetic drift enters our nighttime detective story. Imagine again those tiny groups that survived ancient climate crises. 20 people here, 30 there, scattered across a continent, rising and falling like the meta-populations we talked about earlier. In such small bands, chance becomes powerful. A trait doesn't have to be better to become common. It can simply be lucky if, by sheer accident, a few individuals with slightly lighter sclera happen to be in the subgroup that survived a drought, or crossed a river, or found a refuge valley. Their descendants would carry that trait forward. Not because it made their eyes better at anything, but because they were in the right place when catastrophe struck. Drink a little more of that random luck over tens of thousands of years, bottlenecks, expansions, crashes, migrations, and you can end up with entire populations that share peculiar features, not because those features were strongly favoured, but because alternative versions died out along the way. Some researchers suspect that aspects of our eye morphology, especially the exact degree of depigmentation, could have been sculpted in part by this kind of drift, in a lineage already trending toward more visible eyes for cooperative or self-domestication reasons. Random loss of darker variants in a few key bottlenecks might have tipped the balance toward uniformly white sclera. Sexual selection and drift together make a quiet pair. One adds a whisper of preference, the other rolls evolutionary dice in small, fragile communities. Neither one needs to replace the cooperative eye hypothesis or the self-domestication story. They don't have to. Evolution is rarely a single-cause affair. It's more like a braided river after a flood, channels splitting and rejoining, currents reinforcing one another or cancelling out. Self-domestication might have made our species calmer and lightened our sclera as a side effect. Cooperative pressures might have favoured more visible gaze to coordinate hunts and childcare and teaching. Sexual selection might have gently preferred brighter, clearer eye whites as signals of youth and health. Genetic drift might have frozen some of those changes in place during lean and dangerous centuries, when only a few lineages survived. Layered on top of one another, those forces can create something that looks, to us, intentional, as if evolution set out to sculpt the human eye for a specific purpose. In reality, it's an accumulation, a stack of small biases and blind chances, all recorded in the way light bounces off the front of your eyes when you look at another person in the dark. Tonight, as you feel your own eyelids growing heavier, your sclera quietly reddening with fatigue, you're carrying that history with you. The long echo of ancient storms and ancient choices expressed in a milky arc around the coloured circle of your iris. In the next part of our story, we'll leave the deep past and step into the modern lab. Researchers will dim the lights, flash images of eyes on screens, and test how all these possibilities, cooperation, beauty, drift, play out in real-time judgments of trust and intention. What happens, in other words, when our bright human eyes meet each other in experiments, not just in campfire stories. In those campfire scenes we've been imagining, no one is measuring anything. No one is timing how fast someone spots a glance, or counting how often people choose one pair of eyes over another. They're just living, trusting, doubting, cooperating, betraying. letting their nervous systems do the quiet math. Modern scientists, however, are a little less trusting. They want to know whether those stories we tell about the whites of the eyes actually hold up when you strip away everything else, when you turn off the firelight and turn on a monitor. So, in the last few years, they've started doing something our ancestors never did. They've brought eyes into the lab, not real ones. Pictures, carefully manipulated images of eyes and faces shown to volunteers, both human and non-human, under tightly controlled conditions. And when they do this, some of the intuitions we've been circling suddenly become measurable. One of the most striking examples comes from a group of researchers who worked with both people and chimpanzees. They were interested in something very specific, not beauty, not health, just the simple, mechanical question of how easily you can tell where someone is looking. They took photographs of faces, human and chimpanzee, and then began to tinker with them on a screen. They made the sclera brighter or darker. They shrank the images down so the eyes were small, like someone far away. They played with contrast. In some versions, the pattern looked like a typical chimp eye, darker around the outside, less of that bright ring. In other versions, the eyes were edited to have uniformly white sclera and a darker iris, more like a human. Then they sat 25 humans and 3 chimpanzees in front of these images and trained them to do a simple task. Report where the eyes were pointing, left or right, up or down. Nothing about trust, nothing about cooperation, just, can you read the gaze signal? Under easy conditions, big, clear images, plenty of time. Both species could do this fairly well from most eyes. But when the experimenters made things harder, smaller faces, dimmer contrast, trickier angles, differences began to emerge. Human eyes, with their bright sclera and darker centers, held up better. Both the human participants and the chimpanzees themselves were more accurate at telling where human eyes were looking than where chimp eyes were looking, especially under these low visibility conditions. Then came the twist. When the researchers digitally humanized chimp eyes, lightening the sclera, darkening the iris, the performance of both species improved. The same chimp face, the same head position, the same direction of gaze, but with white sclera suddenly the signal popped. Flip it the other way, darken human sclera to make them more chimp-like, and performance dropped. The bodies, the skull shapes, the hair, none of that changed. The only thing that did was the colour balance inside that small oval of the eye. From those tiny manipulations, one simple conclusion emerges. White sclera really do enhance how visibly gaze direction is encoded. This doesn't mean chimps can't read each other's eyes. They can. They also use head position, body posture, and context in ways we still don't fully understand. But it does suggest that human eye design, bright ring, dark center, is particularly good at broadcasting where attention is pointed, and that this advantage is so basic, so visual, that even chimpanzees, who did not evolve those eyes, can take advantage of it when you give the pattern to them. In other words, the cooperative eye hypothesis passes one of its simplest tests. White sclera aren't just pretty, they function like a low-light, long-distance upgrade for gaze reading. That's one side of the story, the physics of contrast and visibility. The other side is softer, psychological. Even if white sclera make gaze easier to read, do they actually change how we feel about the person whose eyes we're looking at? Do they shape moral judgments, ideas about who will help and who will cheat? To get at that, another team of researchers turned, not to chimpanzees, but to 5-year-old children. 5-year-olds are interesting because they are old enough to cooperate in games, to make choices about partners, but still young enough that a lot of their intuitions operate beneath conscious explanation. They can tell you who they like, who seems nice. They can't easily tell you why the exact curvature of an eyelid or the shade of a sclera made them think that. So the researchers created a series of simple animated faces. Not hyper-realistic, but not cartoons either. Enough detail that the eyes felt like eyes. Then they quietly altered those eyes. Some faces had typical human-like eyes. Dark iris, white sclera. Others had dark sclera, so the whole eye area looked more shadowed. Still others had very large irises, the kind of baby schema change that tends to make faces look cuter without necessarily changing the whites. The children were told simple stories about needing a partner to cooperate in a game, to share stickers, to work together for a reward. Each time they saw two faces side by side and were asked a straightforward question: who do you want to play with? Who seems like the better partner? Across different versions of the experiment, a pattern kept showing up. When one face had white sclera and the other had dark sclera, children tended, on average, to pick the white sclera face as the partner they wanted, when the choice was between a white sclera face and a large iris face. They still tended to pick the white sclera one as more cooperative, even though the large iris faces were often rated as cuter. So whatever the children were responding to, it wasn't just general appeal or babyish charm. It was something specific about those bright rings around the pupils, in the most human-like versions of the faces, where everything else about the appearance was held constant. That preference for white sclera as a marker of cooperativeness was strongest. A 5-year-old can't tell you about the cooperative eye hypothesis. They've never read a paper on primate scleral brightness. Yet their choices quietly echo the idea that white sclera do more than make eyes readable. They also serve as a kind of visual promise. This person is a good bet for joint projects. Bring these two lines of evidence together, the gaze reading study with humans and chimpanzees, and the partner choice study with children, and a deeper possibility emerges. White sclera might be doing double duty. Physically, they sharpen and extend the range of the gaze signal. Psychologically, they nudge observers towards certain social interpretations, more trustworthy, more pro-social, more worth investing in. Once you have that combination, it's easy to imagine a feedback loop. In an ancestral group, some individuals, whether through mutation, self-domestication processes or drift, have slightly lighter, more visible sclera. Others have darker, more camouflaged eyes. The lighter-eyed individuals are just a bit easier to coordinate with. It's slightly clearer when they're paying attention, when they're following your pointing, when they're secretly glancing at you in a tense negotiation. Over time, those same patterns might also pick up a reputation. Children, like in the modern experiment, may feel more at ease around those eyes. Adults may find them easier to read, easier to trust. You don't need anyone to say, "I prefer mates with white sclera." You just need them, in thousands of tiny moments, to give those individuals more chances, more alliances, more cooperative partnerships, more forgiving interpretations when mistakes happen. Cooperative-looking eyes get treated more cooperatively. That cooperative treatment, in turn, makes those individuals and their offspring more likely to survive and reproduce. Somewhere in that loop, phenotype becomes fate. Of course, these are still experiments under artificial conditions. The chimpanzees in the gaze study were few in number and lived in safe sanctuary environments very different from the forests where their wild cousins navigate predators and rival groups. The 5-year-olds in the cooperation study grew up in one particular cultural setting, with particular cartoons, particular norms about looking people in the eye. We don't yet know whether children in every culture, from every background, would show the same bias toward white sclera in partner choices. We don't know exactly how often ancestral humans were in situations where eye color differences alone would decide who teamed up with whom. Lab screens are not savannas. Online animations are not campfires. But the fact that you can dial just one aspect of the eye up or down on a monitor and watch people and chimps respond in systematic ways tells us something important. The sclera is not background. It's an active participant in how we see and evaluate each other. If you pull back from the graphs and statistics and return for a moment to a quieter scene, you can feel what this might have looked like in daily life. Imagine a group of children in a small clearing, long grass whispering at the edges. They're deciding in that wordless way children often do who will be on whose team for a game that only half of them understand. One child stands a little apart, watching. Her eyes are wide, the whites clear and bright against sun-browned skin. When someone looks her way, her gaze meets theirs, then flicks toward the pile of stones they'll use, then back again. Another child looks down more often. His eyes are just as sharp, just as capable of seeing. But in the mottled light beneath the trees, the boundary between iris and sclera is less distinct. It takes a beat longer to know exactly where he's looking. No one votes. There is no formal rule. But as partners are chosen, as hands reach out, somehow the bright-eyed girl ends up in the center of the group, surrounded. The game unfolds around her. Multiply that scene by thousands of afternoons across thousands of years, and it becomes easier to see how tiny, almost invisible preferences can accumulate. The lab gives us the bare bones, reaction times, choice percentages, plots on a graph. Life adds everything else, the dust, the laughter, the tiredness at the end of the day when eyes redden and trust is negotiated without a sound. From here, our story will turn to what those same eyes reveal, not about where we'll look or who we'll choose to play with, but about how we feel inside. Because if white sclera help us read gaze and guess at cooperation, they also betray something even more intimate. Our emotions, our health, the storms moving quietly behind the pupil. Think for a moment about the last time someone said to you, "You look tired." Maybe you'd slept fine. Maybe you thought you were hiding it well, but they weren't reading your sleep log. They weren't analyzing your REM cycles. They were looking at that thin ring of tissue around your iris, the part we casually call the whites, the sclera. In the bright, analytical light of a lab, you can see how sensitive we are to it. Researchers take a photograph of a neutral face, no obvious emotion, no dramatic expression. Then, with a few clicks, they make just one change. They add the faintest hint of redness to the sclera. Tiny, almost invisible veins, a slight loss of clarity. Show those faces to volunteers and ask simple questions. How tired does this person look? How sad? How healthy? How trustworthy? Again and again the pattern appears. Redder sclera push ratings toward tired, sad, unwell. Clearer, brighter sclera pull judgments toward rested, energetic, attractive, even slightly more trustworthy. And the people rating the faces usually have no idea that the only thing that's changed is that thin white backdrop. They'll talk about overall vibe, or say the darker sclera faces just seem off. Their brains are doing the same quiet math our ancestors did around the fire, but now under fluorescent bulbs and statistical software. The sclera is not just a background for the pupil to move against. It's a display surface, a little living billboard for your physiology. Fill the blood vessels near the surface and it flushes red. Irritation, sleep deprivation, smoke, alcohol, the aftermath of tears, the spillover of anger. Let bilirubin build up in the bloodstream when the liver is struggling, and the sclera slowly shift toward yellow. Doctors are trained to look for that shade as one of the first signs of jaundice. Even in ordinary life, people notice. They may not know the biochemical pathways, they just register that something's wrong. In that sense, human sclera have become a health window as well as a gaze window. They track your internal weather, whether you'd like them to or not. Lab experiments, for all their artificiality, hint at how deep this goes. In some studies, researchers don't make sclera bloodshot. They only dull them a little, lowering the brightness and contrast. Participants still tend to see those faces as less vibrant, less appealing, Clear eye whites, even when everything else is held constant, nudge impressions upward. More vitality, more social warmth. It doesn't prove that sclera evolved for beauty, but it does tell us that today, other humans reliably read subtle shifts there as signals of mood and health. And sclera don't work alone. They're framed by some of the most intricate musculature on the human body. Around each eye runs the orbicularis oculos, a ring of muscle that can tighten to narrow the opening, soften into a smile, or clamp shut in pain. Above, the levator palpebrae superioris lifts the upper lid. The frontalis muscle on your forehead can help haul the whole brow ridge upward. Below, tiny fibers tug at the lower lid. Taken together, this machinery allows us to do something unusual among mammals, change how much white is visible, moment to moment, as part of our emotional display. In surprise or sudden fear, the upper eyelid flies up, the lower lid drops slightly and the aperture widens. More sclera shows, especially above and to the sides of the iris. The eye doesn't just look in a direction, it looks open, exposed. In intense attention, watching a distant movement in the dark following an arrow in mid-flight, the same widening reveals more white, making the direction of gaze stand out even more starkly against the surrounding skin. In anger or disgust, something different happens. The upper lid may lower, the brows may draw together, reducing the visible sclera. The gaze becomes more focused, more tunneled. Less of that vulnerable white is exposed. From an evolutionary perspective, this opens up another possibility about why our sclera are so conspicuous. Maybe they didn't just become white to help others track where we're looking. Maybe whiteness also magnified their usefulness as an emotional and physiological display. In small ancestral groups, being able to read the health of others at a glance, who's weak with sickness, who's been up all night with a crying infant, who's drunk, who's boiling with unspoken rage, would carry obvious advantages. You might choose a hunting partner whose eyes are clear over someone whose sclera are yellowed or shot with blood. You might be more cautious around a group member whose whites show an unusual amount around a staring, unmoving iris. Over time, that kind of sensitivity could feed back on the trait itself. Brighter, more uniform sclera make subtle changes more visible. If people unconsciously use those cues to choose partners, allies, even leaders, then the genes that produced clear, readable sclera might gain a quiet edge. We don't have fossils of soft tissue to prove this. No ancient eyeballs preserved in amber. Only the logic of the system we carry now and the behavior of the people who look at it. Interestingly, cultures seem to have intuited this emotional layer long before psychologists gave it names. In Japan, there is a traditional concept called sanpaku, literally 3 whites. In an ordinary front-facing eye, you see sclera on the left and right of the iris, 2 whites. When a third zone of white becomes visible, either above or below the coloured centre, the eye is said to be sanpaku. If the white shows below the iris, lower sanpaku, folk wisdom has often linked it to physical imbalance, fragility, a body out of step with the world, a person supposedly vulnerable to accidents, illness, misfortune. If the white shows above the iris, upper sanpaku, the association tilts more toward mental or emotional disturbance, intensity that borders on volatility. A soul said to be at risk of losing control. From a modern medical standpoint, there are straightforward anatomical and physiological reasons why someone might show more sclera above or below. The way their lids are set in the skull, the pull of particular muscles, the effects of aging, thyroid disease or surgery. There is no good evidence that sanpaku eyes can predict fate. But the very fact that such a rich vocabulary grew up around this small detail tells us something. People noticed that eyes with unusual scleral exposure felt different to look at, that they seemed more haunted, more anxious, more intense, more unstable. They wrapped stories of destiny around that feeling. Cultural narratives in that sense are like decorative frames round an old painting. The frame can change. The underlying sensitivity to scleral show is much older, and Sanpaku is only one example. Many traditions, from European physiognomy to folk sayings on every continent, link clear, bright eyes with honesty and health, bloodshot eyes with vice or sorrow, shifty eyes with deceit. Modern experiments now show that, stripped of words, people still make those associations when they rate photographs on screens. Their nervous systems, like those 5-year-olds in the cooperation study, are tracking things their conscious minds rarely articulate. When we add this emotional and physiological dimension to the story of the human eye, the evolutionary picture becomes more tangled, but also more complete. White sclera are not only about cooperation in the narrow sense of shared tasks and joint attention. They're also about managing the full spectrum of social information: health, fatigue, sincerity, fear, anger, emotional volatility. Eyes that are easy to read are not just good for coordinating a hunt. They're good for knowing whom to comfort, whom to avoid, when to press a point in an argument and when to back off because someone's inner temperature has already risen too high. Other primates use eye and facial cues too, of course, and, as we've seen, some of them do have patches of pale sclera that show under certain postures and expressions. But in humans, the combination seems particularly exaggerated. Uniformly light sclera, frequent exposure, and hyper-expressive muscles. Our eyes became not just flashlights of attention, but lanterns of emotion. Once that happened, every glance carried more data. A tilted look across the fire reveals where your ally is focusing, whether their eyes are bright with interest or dull with exhaustion, whether the corners are crinkled with genuine amusement or held flat and cold. In that small, shimmering space of sclera and iris, millions of years of survival pressures, cultural stories, and personal histories meet. From here, our path leads outward from the biology to the broader human world, because not every culture treats that emotional lantern the same way. Some encourage you to meet it head-on. Others warn you to look away. The sclera may betray our inner world, but societies decide how much of that betrayal is polite to notice. Imagine a stranger walking toward you down a quiet street. Same distance, same pace, same neutral expression. The only thing that changes is what their eyes do. In one version, as they pass, they meet your gaze, hold it for a second or two, give the faintest nod, then look away. In another, their eyes skim past you, never quite landing. They glance at your face and instantly flick elsewhere. You feel something, maybe slight relief, maybe slight suspicion. In yet another, they lock on and don't let go, their pupils pinned on you long after a polite interval has passed. Your pulse does a little jump all 3 times, but how you interpret that jump depends a lot on where and how you were raised. In many contemporary Western settings, especially in Europe and North America, you're taught from childhood that looking people in the eye is a virtue. Parents coach kids. Eyes up when you talk. Job interviews reward candidates who can hold a steady gaze without flinching. Teachers read downward glances as guilt, dishonesty, or lack of confidence. Direct eye contact becomes a kind of social handshake, a way to show you're present, sincere, engaged. But move the same scenario to a classroom in Tokyo or Seoul or many other East Asian cities, and the rules begin to shift. There, holding a teacher's eyes for too long can feel confrontational, even rude. Respect is often signalled with a softened gaze, a brief look followed by a slight downward turn of the eyes. You listen with your ears, not by drilling your stare into the speaker's face. Psychologists have brought volunteers from different cultures into quiet labs to study this. When Finnish participants and Japanese participants watch faces that suddenly turn to make eye contact, their bodies do something similar at first. Heart rates shift, Attention snaps toward the gaze. Eye contact, no matter the culture, is a biological event. The human nervous system treats a direct look as important. But then the cultural software kicks in. Finnish viewers tend to describe the direct gaze as open, interested, approachable. Japanese viewers watching the same kinds of images are more likely to describe the faces with direct gaze as a bit more tense, a bit angrier, a bit less comfortable to be around. Same stimulus, same white sclera, revealing gaze direction in the same fraction of a second. Different rules for what it means. And those rules aren't just a Western East Asian contrast. Across many indigenous groups, and in a number of African societies, there are long-standing norms that children should not meet the eyes of elders too boldly. A teenager staring straight back at an older relative might be read as insolent, challenging, getting above themselves. In some communities, women are discouraged from holding the gaze of unrelated men. In others, hunters and ritual specialists have special ways of looking, or not looking, at animals, leaders, or sacred objects. To an outsider raised in a culture that prizes eye contact, averted eyes might feel like evasiveness. To an insider, it is exactly the opposite, a practiced, respectful way of containing the power of the gaze, a way of saying, without words, I see you, I honour the distance between us. If you zoom out even further, beyond human societies, this patchwork of meanings begins to look familiar. Among many monkeys and apes, a direct, prolonged stare is not an invitation to connect. It's a threat. Two male macaques locking eyes for too long are not bonding. They are on the edge of violence. A subordinate animal will often break eye contact, turn its head, make itself smaller to diffuse the situation. Yet, in other primates, especially in more tolerant egalitarian groups, eye contact can be part of grooming, play, even what looks to us like affection. The spectrum is wide, from look at me and we fight, to look at me and we belong together. Human cultures seem to have stretched that same spectrum into language, etiquette, and ritual. In a job interview in New York, meeting someone's gaze firmly may signal the cooperative side of the primate spectrum. I'm here with you, I'm honest, let's coordinate. In a village meeting in another part of the world, dropping your eyes at the right moment may signal the deference side. I am not challenging you. I recognize our roles. The underlying machinery, the white sclera, the hypersensitive reaction to being looked at is shared. The stories built on top of it differ. Those stories are not only social, they're spiritual. Long before anyone spoke of social cognition or joint attention, people had already noticed that a look can feel like a touch, that someone's eyes can stir your skin with no physical contact at all. In many parts of the Mediterranean, the Middle East and South Asia, that insight hardened into one of the oldest, widest spread beliefs on earth, the evil eye. In this worldview, the gaze is not just a signal, it is a force, an envious look, a lingering stare heavy with resentment or desire can harm the person it falls upon. It can wither crops, sicken children, spoil milk, bring sudden bad luck. The solution is not to pretend eyes are harmless. It is to arm yourself with more eyes. Blue glass amulets shaped like staring orbs. Hands with stylized eyes on their palms. Painted eyes on houses, boats, jewelry, cradles. The eye becomes both weapon and shield. Travel back further to ancient Egypt, and you find yet another layer of sacred seeing. On coffins and sarcophagi from the Old Kingdom onward, artisans painted pairs of eyes on the side facing east. These were not decorative, they were functional in a ritual sense. Windows through which the dead person's spirit could gaze out toward the rising sun, rejoining the cycle of light. The famous Eye of Horus symbol, part falcon, part human, lined and stylized, was worn as an amulet for protection and healing. It represented restoration after injury, divine perception, the power to see and be seen by the gods. Eyes were carved into the prows of ships to help them see their way through dangerous waters, painted on statues so that deities could more fully inhabit their stone bodies. When people said later that the eyes are the windows to the soul, they were echoing something very old. Classical writers like Cicero described the face as a picture of the mind and the eyes as its interpreters. Biblical texts spoke of the eye as the lamp of the body, filling it with light or darkness depending on what it beheld. By the time the modern English phrase crystallized, attached to poets and philosophers and sometimes misattributed to Renaissance masters, it was crystallizing a long intuition that the bright shifting whites at the front of the skull reveal something about what is invisible behind them. Art quietly recorded this obsession. Look at Egyptian reliefs and you see eyes picked out with dark pigment, sclera implied by clean almond shapes that dominate the face. Move to Byzantine icons, and the gaze of saints and Christ centers the viewer, huge and unblinking, whites exaggerated against gold halos. These eyes are meant to look through you, not merely at you. In Renaissance Europe, portrait painters learned to choreograph gaze with exquisite precision. A noblewoman looks slightly away, eyes softened, signaling modesty and restraint. A merchant meets the viewer head-on, his pale sclera bright against the shadows, projecting competence and worldly confidence. Lovers glance sideways toward each other, their shared gaze creating a triangle of intimacy that viewers are invited to witness but not interrupt. The tiny crescent of bottom-showing sclera could suggest innocence or vulnerability. A half-lidded upper lid might hint at secrecy, tiredness, or seduction. These choices were not random. They mirrored the same rules people lived by in churches, courts, and marketplaces. Who was allowed to look at whom, for how long, and with what implied power. We carry these pre-digital traditions into very modern spaces. On video calls, people often report a faint unease. You see a face, you see eyes, you see the white sclera clearly, but the geometry is wrong. To look at someone on your screen, you have to look slightly down from the camera to make it look like you're making eye contact. You have to stare at the little black lens instead of at their actual face. You end up in a strange in-between state, looked at but not quite met. Your ancient orienting reflex fires for a direct gaze that never fully materializes. Meanwhile, folklore about eyes and truth lingers in more mundane places. Advice columns insist you can spot a liar because they won't look you in the eye, or because their gaze shifts too much. In reality, studies of deception are messier. Skilled liars often overcompensate, holding eye contact slightly too long. Cultural norms muddy the picture further. But the fact that these bits of folk wisdom persist tells us that people still believe eyes are broadcasting honesty or deceit in ways words can't easily mask. Technologists have noticed this too. Eye tracking software follows the dart of your pupils across advertising, websites, game screens. Marketers pore over heat maps of gaze to see where attention pools, where it avoids. Security designers wonder if patterns of eye movement could authenticate identity or detect stress. All of this lives downstream from a simple anatomical choice made long before there were screens or amulets. The choice by evolution to leave our sclera mostly unpigmented, to contrast iris and white so starkly that even in low light, from several meters away, another human can see where we are looking and how much of that white shows. Culture then took that raw signal and wove an astonishing variety of meanings around it. In one place, a bright, steady gaze is a moral virtue. In another, a dangerous flirtation with rudeness. In one ritual, eyes are openings for gods to enter. In another, projectors of envy that must be deflected with talismans. Underneath those differences, the physics of light on sclera and iris stays the same. Our eyes are easy to read because of deep, biological pressures, the same ones that, in lab experiments, lead 5-year-olds to trust faces with clear white sclera a little more than faces with darkened whites. What varies is how much we choose to read them and how publicly. Eye contact norms, in that sense, are like cultural clothing for a naked evolutionary trait. Some societies wrap the gaze in layers of modesty and ritual. Others leave it bare and celebrate its directness. Either way, those pale windows are there, glowing in the firelight and the blue of our screens, carrying far more information than any of our ancestors 800,000 years ago could have imagined. And somewhere between those ancient selection pressures and our modern etiquette lies another question. When did our eyes start to look like this at all? How far back does this bright, readable sclera go in our family tree? For that, we have to turn from culture to fossils, and to the awkward fact that soft tissue almost never survives. When you first turn to the fossil record for answers, it feels a bit like opening a book and discovering that every single page about eyes has been carefully torn out. Bones fossilize. Teeth fossilize. Sometimes, if conditions are perfect, even hair or skin impressions leave a ghostly trace. But the whites of the eye? The delicate membrane of the sclera, the thin film of blood vessels and connective tissue? They rot, they collapse, they vanish. If you dig up 100,000-year-old skull and cradle it carefully in your hands, the eye sockets stare back at you as blank stone. There is no trace of how much white once showed, or whether it was bright and unpigmented like yours, or darker, more like a chimpanzee's. So when we ask, when did human eyes start to look like ours, the honest answer is, we don't know. Not in the way we know the age of a stone tool or the shape of a femur. We're stuck with indirect clues and a lot of very careful guesswork. One of the first places scientists look for those clues is the skull itself. If you line up skulls from earlier members of our genus, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, some of the other archaic forms, and then place a modern human skull at the end of the row, a few trends jump out. The faces become flatter, less jutting, the brow ridges soften. The brain case rounds out into a more globular shape. The eye sockets, or orbits, shift subtly in angle and proportion. To some researchers, that combination looks familiar from another context: domestication. When wild animals are bred, generation after generation, for lower aggression and higher tolerance, foxes, dogs, even some experimental rats, their bodies often change in a package deal. Shorter snouts, floppier ears, changes in pigmentation, a more juvenile look that sticks round into adulthood. Humans, the argument goes, may have done something similar to ourselves. Over hundreds of thousands of years, selection might have favoured individuals who were just a little less reactive, a little more tolerant, better at getting along in tight social spaces. The overall look of the face would shift towards something softer, less threatening. Within that self-domestication framework, our bright exposed sclera slip into place as one more trait in the bundle, a calmer, more expressive face, eyes that show direction and emotion more clearly, sclera that gradually lose pigment and stand out against the iris. If that story is even partly right, then the timeline for our white eyes is tangled up with the timeline for our social lives. So scientists turn to another set of clues, the things our ancestors left behind when they weren't busy fossilizing. At sites dating to several 100,000 years ago, long before purely modern Homo sapiens appear, we already see signs of complex cooperation. There are animal bones that bear the distinct marks of coordinated hunting, not just scavenging. Herd animals driven into traps, large carcasses processed efficiently, the kind of task that would be very hard to pull off without precise silent coordination. There are traces of long-distance transport. Stone from quarries many kilometres away, carried or traded into new regions. There are hints of shared childcare and extended kin networks, older individuals who lived with injuries or disabilities that would have required help from others. Later, by the time early Homo sapiens fossils appear in Africa, around 300,000 years ago in places like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, the archaeological record starts to shimmer with even more social complexity, more standardized tools, pigments that might have been used for body decoration, possible ritual activity. Each of these bits of evidence tells the same broad story. By this time, our ancestors were not just clever apes eking out a living. They were deeply entangled with one another, watching, coordinating, planning, teaching, sharing. And in that kind of world, eyes that clearly broadcast, "I'm looking there, not here," would have been incredibly useful. You can imagine small bands on the savannah or in patchy woodland, moving together in quiet formation. A hunter freezes, glances sideways, and with the smallest shift of visible white tells a partner exactly where a prey animal is hiding. You can imagine cooperative child rearing, where multiple adults keep track of toddlers darting around a camp. A quick flash of sclera from one caregiver draws another's attention without a word. You can imagine early language, not yet the torrent of words we use now, but a growing web of shared symbols and sounds. Even with speech, tracking the direction of each other's gaze would anchor conversations in the world. That rock, this plant, those clouds, all of that is speculation. But it's anchored in the simple logic of social life. Once you're heavily dependent on cooperation, for hunting, for raising young, for long-distance alliances, any anatomical tweak that makes your gaze easier to read could be amplified by natural selection. Does that mean our eyes waited until Homo sapiens proper, 300,000 years ago, to turn bright and readable? Maybe, but they could also have started changing earlier, in the common ancestors we shared with other archaic humans. That's where the Neanderthals and Denisovans enter the picture. Neanderthals living in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia had large brains, sophisticated tools, and cultural practices that included deliberate burial and probably care for the sick and injured. Denisovans, scattered across much of Asia, left their genetic fingerprints in modern populations from Tibet to New Guinea, suggesting they too were widely successful, adaptable, and socially complex. Did they have white sclera like ours? We don't know. From Neanderthals, we have beautifully preserved skulls, and now several high-quality genomes. Those genomes tell us about variation in genes related to hair and skin and iris colour. Some Neanderthals may have had fairer skin, some may have had lighter hair. Their eye colours probably ranged, as ours do. But none of that data reaches the sclera. The specific patterns of melanin, or lack of it, across that thin white membrane are still hidden from us. It is entirely possible that Neanderthals looked you in the eye with pale whites, very much like a modern human. It is possible their sclera were darker, more camouflaged, closer to many other apes. It is possible they fell somewhere in between, with more variation from individual to individual than we tend to show today. The same cloud of uncertainty hovers over Denisovans. Their DNA tells us fascinating things about altitude adaptation and starch digestion, hints of plant medicine use and seafaring. It cannot yet paint their eyes, so instead of a clean answer, white sclera appeared on Tuesday 350,000 years ago in this valley, we're left with a spectrum of possibilities. One possibility is late. Our lineage keeps relatively darker, more variable sclera through most of its history, and then, as Homo sapiens spread and self-domestication effects deepen, bright whites become more common and eventually standard. Another possibility is earlier and shared. Some degree of scleral lightening appears already in a common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Perhaps linked to the rise of cooperative hunting and complex social structures. Different branches then tweak that trait in different directions. A third possibility is messy. variation in scleral pigmentation ebbs and flows across populations, influenced by local social ecologies, more cooperative here, more competitive there. Until, by chance plus selection, one particular constellation of genes and behaviours locks in the pattern we now think of as typical human eyes. Modern genetics can see the outlines of the machinery that would be involved in any of these stories. Genes that affect melanin production and distribution in skin, hair and the iris, names like OCA2, SLC24A5, SLC45A2, MC1R, also plausibly touch the sclera. Some of these genes show clear signs of recent selection in our species. They've shifted as humans moved into different climates and different light conditions, as diets changed, as cultural preferences emerged. But there is no single white sclera gene, no simple switch we can point to and say, here, this mutation turned on the whites of our eyes at exactly this date. Instead, we see a tangled web of pigment pathways and developmental processes, many of which probably influence the sclera in small, subtle ways. And even when we can time a change in one of those genes, say a variant that spread rapidly in some human populations after a certain date, we still can't be sure whether it was scleral brightness, skin tone, iris colour, or some combination that natural selection was really looking at. So we come back to that staring skull, its eye sockets empty, and we have to do something scientists are not always comfortable with. We have to hold several stories in mind at once. We know that other primates live along a continuum of scleral coloration. Some have very dark, cryptic eyes. Others, including certain apes and monkeys, show surprising patches of pale sclera and high contrast. Humans sit at one extreme of that continuum, unusually uniform, unusually bright. We know that across primates, species with brighter sclera tend to live in more cooperative, tolerant societies, a statistical pattern, not a law, but one that fits neatly with the cooperative eye and self-domestication ideas. We know that by the time our own species appears in the fossil record, the rest of our faces already look tuned for social signalling. Softer bones, more mobile brows, musculature capable of subtle, rapid expressions. What we don't know is exactly when, in the long slide from fierce, rugged faces to the ones we see in the mirror, our sclera crossed some invisible threshold from sometimes pale to reliably bright and readable. It might have been a gradual fade, barely noticeable to the people living through it. Children just happening, generation by generation, to have slightly clearer eye whites than their grandparents, and those children happening to thrive in a world where being easy to read was a survival advantage. Or it might have been more punctuated, tied to demographic bottlenecks and bursts of expansion, where a particular set of eye traits rode the wave as small groups spread and multiplied. For now, the fossil record stays silent. The genes whisper, but not quite loudly enough. All we can do is stand at this point in time with our very conspicuous eyes and look backward into the dark, knowing that somewhere along that path, the way we look at each other and the way we are seen changed forever. And even without a precise date, that realization sets the stage for one last question. If we can't yet say exactly when our eyes turned bright, can we at least piece together why so many different forces seem to have pushed them in the same direction? Imagine evolution as a landscape after rain. Up in the hills, a dozen thin streams begin to form. One flows out of cooperative hunting, another seeps from self-domestication and reduced aggression. A third trickles from sexual preferences and beauty standards. Others run from simple genetic drift, from changes in infant development, from shifting climates and social ecologies. For a long time, each of these streams is small, local, easy to miss. But as they run downhill, they begin to meet. 2 trickles join, then 3, then 10. By the time they reach the valley, they're no longer separate lines of water. They've become a single wide river. Your eyes, the bright whites, the easy-to-read gaze, are that river. No single stream explains the flood. If we step back from all the individual hypotheses and studies and caveats we've explored, a pattern comes into focus. First, there is cooperation. Across more than 100 primate species, brighter sclera tend to show up in animals that tolerate each other more, help each other more, live in social worlds where conflict is managed rather than exploding into lethal violence. Darker sclera, more pigmented and cryptic, tend to cluster in species where aggression within the group is more deadly. That doesn't prove cause and effect, but it fits very neatly with the cooperative eye idea and with self-domestication. It suggests that eyes are not just decorative, they're entangled with how a species lives together. In that context, human eyes look like the endpoint of a familiar process. We're not an exception falling from the sky. We're what you get when a common primate trait, visible sclera, gets pushed, generation after generation, toward maximum readability. At the same time, there is camouflage. In a world where looking at the wrong individual at the wrong moment can trigger an attack, being able to hide your gaze has advantages. Dark sclera, less contrast, less exposed white. All of that makes your eye direction harder to read. Instead of picking one side as right and the other as wrong, the comparative work suggests they are two sides of the same coin. In more competitive, violent social environments, gaze hiding is useful. In more cooperative, tolerant ones, gaze broadcasting is useful. The sclera sit in the middle and respond to whichever pressure is stronger. Then there is self-domestication. As our ancestors began living in denser groups, sharing food, raising young together, punishing the most violent members, selection seems to have favoured individuals who are less explosively aggressive. Their bodies changed in that familiar domestication syndrome bundle. Softer faces, altered hormones, shifts in pigmentation. Lighter sclera could easily have ridden along as a side effect of that broader process. Depigmentation shows up again and again in domesticated animals. You don't need the eye whites to be the original target of selection for them to end up changed. Once they are changed, though, once eyes are bright and childlike and readable, other forces can grab hold of them. That's where sexual selection and aesthetics enter the river system. In experiments with modern humans, young children already see white sclera eyes as signs of cooperation. They pick those faces as better partners, even when all other features are held constant. Adults too read clear, bright sclera as cues of health and trustworthiness. We notice redness, yellowing, dullness. We respond, often without knowing we're doing it. Over thousands of generations, small biases like that can accumulate. If people consistently prefer mates whose eyes look healthy and expressive and bright, those preferences can nudge sclera in a particular direction, even if the original change had nothing to do with mate choice. Layer on top of that the simple randomness of genetic drift. When populations are small or go through bottlenecks, certain variants can become more common not because they are spectacularly useful, but because they happen to be present in the individuals who survive and reproduce. Maybe, in one ancestral population, a cluster of pigment changes happen to be present among the survivors of a harsh period. Maybe those survivors were also part of a social world that increasingly favoured cooperation and reduced aggression. Once that combination existed, cultural preferences and social payoffs could amplify what chance began. The newer data on other primates doesn't tear this story up, it makes it richer. For a long time, the story was simple. Humans have white sclera, apes have dark sclera, therefore our eyes must be uniquely adapted for cooperation. Now we know that isn't quite right. Wild chimpanzees are not a uniform mass of dark eyes. Some have clearly white sclera. Many have patchy or lighter sclera that darken with age. Their irises often contrast with the sclera enough that gaze direction can still be seen. Other mammals, dogs, some hoofed animals, Even certain monkeys also show pale eye whites under the right conditions. Instead of a hard line between eyes that show gaze and eyes that hide it, we find a spectrum, a continuum running from heavily pigmented, low-contrast eyes that are hard to read, through mixed and patchy forms, all the way to the uniformly bright, high-contrast, always-on signalling eyes that you see in the mirror. Humans are not the only point on that line. We're just an extreme one. That actually fits beautifully with the multi-cause picture. If eye appearance was shaped by the same broad forces, competition versus cooperation, aggression versus tolerance, chance events, aesthetic preferences, across many primates, then we'd expect exactly what we see. A landscape of eyes, each species occupying its own niche. Bonobos, with their more tolerant societies, sliding toward lighter sclera. Some monkeys living in dangerous competitive groups, sliding toward darker eyes. Chimpanzees scattered along the middle, their infants born with lighter sclera that often darken over time, hinting at developmental knobs evolution can turn. And humans, pushed by a unique blend of self-domestication, cooperative dependence, cultural signalling and beauty standards, sliding all the way to the bright edge. Underneath the comparative charts and the gene names, there is a quieter message about what kind of animal we are. We are a species that evolved to be seen looking. Our eyes do not just take in light, they send it out, in the sense that anyone who glances at you can see, instantly, not only that you are awake and alive, but exactly where your attention rests. That is a very intimate thing to share. Every time you hold another person's gaze, you're exposing a piece of your mental world. What matters to you in this moment, what you're tracking, where your thoughts might be heading next. Our sclera make that exposure effortless, automatic, almost impossible to hide unless we work at it. Over time, cultures have learned to play with that visibility. Some societies treat direct eye contact as a sign of respect and honesty. Others see it as aggressive or intrusive. Religious art paints holy figures with enormous luminous eyes. Folktales warn against shifty eyes that can't hold your gaze. Poets describe beloved eyes as clear, bright, limpid. Health and beauty and character all rolled into one. Long before anyone measured scleral brightness in a lab, people intuited that the whites of the eye were more than anatomy. They were windows into intention and emotion. Science, in its way, has been catching up to that intuition. Carefully, slowly, with error bars and cautious language. But the convergence is striking. The very features we have mythologized, brightness, clarity, expressive movement, turn out to be the ones most deeply tied to cooperation, trust, and social life. And yet, for all that, much of the story remains unwritten. We still don't know which exact genes tune pigment in the sclera, and how those genes interact with hormones during development. We don't know how early infant eye appearance feeds back into the behavior of caregivers, and how that might, in turn, shape selection. We need broader cross-species data sets, more than a few dozen primate faces per species, photographed in consistent ways. We need to watch eyes change across lifetimes, not just freeze them in single snapshots. We need experiments that ask how different cultures, with different norms about gaze, read the same eyes. Do people in societies that avoid direct eye contact read subtle scleral changes differently than people in societies that seek it out? Does a bright eye mean trustworthy everywhere, or does its meaning shift with custom and story and ritual? Those are questions for future field workers and lab teams and careful statisticians. For now, we sit with a river whose sources we can trace partway uphill, but not yet to every spring. So let's go back one last time to that dim room. You're sitting quietly. Maybe it's evening. Maybe you're half tired, half awake, the way people have been when they listen to stories for as long as stories have existed. Across the space, someone glances up at you. In an instant, you catch it. A brief flicker of white against iris, a tiny shift in direction. Your brain tracks the angle automatically, reconstructs the line of sight, guesses at what they've noticed or what they're feeling. Layered into that moment is 100 million years of primate evolution. The same basic eye structure shared by monkeys, apes, and lemurs. The subtle tweaks of pigment pathways. The long, slow tug-of-war between competition and cooperation. There are the echoing pressures of self-domestication, the quiet culling of the most violent temperaments, the growing weight of social dependence, shared hunts, shared childcare, shared stories around fires. There are ancient preferences for clear, bright eyes, tiny biases in mate choice that nudged certain traits forward. There is the role of the dice in small populations, the genetic lottery that fixed certain variants and lost others. There are millennia of cultural meaning. The eyes are the window to the soul. Look me in the eye and say that. Her eyes were so bright. Laws written, oaths sworn, love confessed, all under the watch of eyes not so different from yours. All of that, folded into a single silent look drifting across a room. You feel seen. You feel that your own gaze, your own attention, has been caught and gently held. And somewhere, beneath the calm surface of that awareness, the river continues to flow. If you zoom out even farther, past the genes and the skulls and the comparative charts, something simple comes into focus. Your eyes are not just tools for seeing the world. They are organs for being seen in the world. Long before there were words, before there were villages or myths or carved stones, there were glances. Two individuals noticing the same rustle in the grass. One looking up at the clouds and the other following that gaze without needing to be pulled by the hand. Biologists call this joint attention. Two minds pointed at the same thing, each aware that the other is also looking there. It sounds technical, but in practice it's as ordinary as a parent and a baby both turning to watch a bird, or two hunters silently tracking the same animal across a valley. In modern infants, joint attention usually switches on around the end of the first year of life. It happens before fluent speech, before full-blown language, sometimes even before the first clear words. A baby will follow eyes, not just heads. They'll check back and forth between an object and a caregiver's gaze, as if asking, "Do you see it too?" Those bright, easy-to-read sclera are like high-contrast arrows attached to every glance. They make joint attention cheaper, faster, more reliable. You don't need to guess what another mind is tracking. It's written right there in the whites of their eyes. From that small trick, a lot of other things can grow. If you can see that someone is looking at a tool, you can guess they might want to learn to use it. If you can see that they're watching your hands as you shape a stone, you can slow down, exaggerate the movements, make your technique teachable. Teaching, as far as we can tell from the comparative work, is one of the things humans do more intensively than any other primate. Other apes can copy, can learn by watching, but systematic instruction, shared projects, let me show you moments, those are our specialty. It's not hard to imagine how that might have started with eyes. Generation after generation, infants who were especially good at reading gaze would have had an easier time plugging into other minds, learning where food was, where danger lurked, what tool shape worked best. Adults who were especially expressive with their eyes, who made their attention legible, might have had more successful students, more competent allies, more appealing potential mates. Over time, that feedback loop could knit gaze, teaching, and culture into a single tangled rope. Once you can reliably share attention, you can begin to share intentions, to plan together, to coordinate not just, we both see that animal, but you go left, I'll go right. Theoretical work by people like Michael Tomasello argues that this rich shared intentionality, sits at the root of language, norms, even morality. Whether or not that picture is complete, there's a deep plausibility to the idea that language grew up in the shadow of our eyes, early vocal sounds layered on top of glances and pointing and shared looks. Words at first were probably not replacing gaze, but riding on it, amplifying a conversation that had already begun in silence. There is a paradox here, though. By making our gaze so visible, evolution opened us up. A bright sclera is like a permanent confession. Anyone around you can see what has caught your attention. In a small face-to-face group, that's a lot of information to give away. Where you're looking can reveal what you want, what you fear, who you care about, who you distrust. That transparency is powerful, but it's also vulnerable. If others can see what you're attending to, they can help you. They can notice when your eyes dart toward danger, when your attention keeps slipping back to a crying child, when you're secretly interested in a new tool but too shy to ask. They can also manipulate you. A clever individual can fake a gaze, pretend not to notice something, deliberately misdirect attention. They can watch where everyone else is looking and take advantage. Social animals are never just honest cooperators. They're also tacticians, reading and gaming each other's signals. So why didn't selection simply push us back toward darker, more cryptic eyes, the way it seems to have in more combative primate societies? The balance of evidence suggests that for our lineage, the benefits of being readable outweighed the costs of being exposed. The gains from cooperation, teaching, mutual aid, and shared culture were simply larger than the risks of being occasionally deceived or judged. We became a species that survives by pooling information, not hoarding it. In that kind of world, being able to see what others see is an advantage, even if it sometimes hurts. You can feel that tension in everyday life. Think about a time you avoided someone's eyes because you didn't want them to know you were upset, or a moment when holding someone's gaze felt almost too intimate, like telling them a secret without speaking. Your anatomy is pulling you toward connection. Your social brain is sometimes pulling you back, reminding you that to be seen is to be vulnerable. The modern world adds a strange twist to all of this. For hundreds of thousands of years, our eyes evolved under open sky and firelight, in small bands where faces were familiar and gaze was mostly shared in person. Now, much of our attention flows through glass and pixels. On screens, gaze becomes ambiguous. A video call face can appear to look at you but really be focused slightly above or below the camera. Millions of people stare into tiny lights alone in dark rooms, feeling watched and unseen at the same time. We also wrap and edit our faces in ways our ancestors never anticipated. Sunglasses slice off the top half of the social signal. They hide the pupil, dull the contrast, turn eyes into glossy black mirrors. Studies find that when both eyes and lower face are obscured, behind sunglasses and masks together, strangers look less trustworthy, less familiar, harder to read. Our brains, tuned for sclera and subtle muscle shifts, struggle when too much is hidden. Cloth masks, as many people noticed recently, change the equation in the opposite direction. They cover mouths and cheeks, forcing others to rely more heavily on the area around the eyes. Experiments suggest that masked faces can seem slightly harder to read and slightly less trustworthy on average. And yet people also adapt. They put more smile into the crinkling of the eye, more emotion into the brows. Even when we cover our signals, we find ways to route around the blockage. All of this is new in an evolutionary sense. The genes shaping our sclera were not chosen in a world of aviators and medical masks and front-facing cameras. They were chosen in a world where, if you wanted to know what someone was thinking about, you had to be close enough to see the whites of their eyes.